Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. So today it's appropriate that we take a look at how the Irish agricultural sector plans to adapt to the current and expected changes in our climate. And to discuss this further, I'm delighted to be joined by Damien Wyse, Higher Education Executive Officer in Climate Change and Bioenergy Policy Unit in the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And we're also joined by our very own Dr. Michael O'Donovan, Head of the Teagasc Grassland Science Department based in Moore Park. So today, Damien, you're going to give us a presentation, and Michael, you're also going to give us a presentation. Damien, I think you got the flip of the coin, so you'll kick us off this morning's presentation. You're going to be focusing on the adaptation plan that your department has developed or in consultation with stakeholders. And so this is very much focusing on how we plan for the negative effects of climate change, and I suppose also the positive effects of climate change. Is that something that will feature?
It is something that came up, but much less so. We focused on the priority impacts and the negative. I mean, you do hear some talk about an extended grazing season, potential benefits of that, but there are complications around that. Say that the extension to the season being at the shoulders could have issues with trafficability of the land. So even the positives with climate change aren't necessarily as straightforward as it might appear. But presentation today focused mostly on unfortunately the negatives, the impacts, and that's mostly what is focused on in the plan and how we'll adapt to that.
Right. Okay, so Damien, if you could share your screen with us, and we will hear your presentation. And a reminder to everybody, if you have your questions ready, you can submit them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll endeavour to put all of your questions to the two speakers today. So over to you, Damien.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. And on behalf of the department, thanks to Teagasc for giving us the opportunity to do this presentation today and talk a bit more about adaptation in the agricultural sector. My presentation focuses on a brief overview of exactly what we mean when we talk about climate change adaptation. I'll discuss some of the policy influences, both international and domestic, and some of the broader context that fit into our creation of the sectoral adaptation plan. For those who saw Keith Lampkin's excellent presentation last week, I'll reiterate some of the information that we considered around projected changes for Ireland's climate. As part of the work in producing the adaptation plan, we conducted a national scale assessment of current and potential future climate impacts. And as part of an impact and vulnerability assessment, from this we produced a list of priority impacts that we expect to see from climate change. And I'll briefly outline some of those, as well as some of the cross-sectoral adaptation issues. And then I'll go through some of the case studies that we featured in the plan and measures, potential adaptation measures contained in those that could be considered. So what is adaptation? Climate change adaptation refers to how we plan for the negative effects of climate change and take suitable action to prevent or minimize the damage it can cause. Adaptation planning allows us to build resilience to changes in our climate, allowing society to take advantage of any opportunities that might bring. Ireland's climate is changing in line with global patterns. So an increase in mean annual air temperature, the number of warm days, increase in number of annual frost days, and an increase in annual rainfall. But even if we were to become a carbon neutral society tomorrow, our climate is going to continue to change. So sustainable adaptation is going to be necessary one way or another, and the agricultural sector must be. So here are some of the adaptation policy influences that feed into our work in this area. Internationally, there's the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and Goal 13, as you can see, is particularly relevant to adaptation work. There's the Green Deal, with a proposal to enshrine adaptation strategy law, a step up on adaptation across the EU. Domestically, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act 2015 gives statutory authority to the work that we do in the area. On the adaptation side, the National Adaptation Framework, arising out of the Act, gives a framework for how we create our sectoral adaptation plan. And we created it alongside, it was done as a whole of government approach to creating adaptation plans. So agriculture is one sector, but there are 11 others, such as biodiversity, water infrastructure and water quality. And our own plan, for example, contains agriculture, forest and seafood, which are three related sectors all taken together. And then there's the climate action plan to tackle climate disruption, which the next iteration of that is currently being discussed as well. The Climate Change Advisory Council, an independent advisory body tasked with assessing and advising on how the country is making the transition to a low carbon, climate resilient and environmentally sustainable economy. They also feed into our work and provide commentary and guidance. They're established in 2016. In their 2019 review, just one point, that adaptation is continuous learning and improvement process. And really we're with this first statutory plan, it's an iterative process, but this is the first statutory plan. So in a way, although there has been adaptation work ongoing, we're at the start of a formal coordinated process here. In December 2019, was a review of the sectoral adaptation plan making. The CCSE noted that although climate adaptation is expensive, inaction will likely cost more. Good progress has been made, but gaps remain. And perhaps the most important point that they made for our work in the department is that to date, awareness of the need for adaptation remains poor. And to counter this, we need to ensure adaptation is properly mainstreamed in policy. The IPCC 2019 Climate Change and Land Special Report also were considering land provides the principal basis for human livelihoods and well-being, including the supply of food. It's both a source and a sink of greenhouse gases, and land ecosystems and biodiversity are vulnerable to ongoing climate change and weather and climate extremes. Sustainable land management can contribute to reducing the negative impacts of multiple stresses, including climate change on ecosystems and societies. So, what changes in climate are likely to be the greatest impact on the agriculture sector? Again, this will be familiar to anyone who saw Keith's presentation last week. In conducting our risk assessment as part of the sector adaptation plan, we identified the following projected changes in climate as those most likely to impact on the sector. So, drier summers, average temperature increase of 1.6 towards mid-century, and this may look like a small change, but a small change in the average can have a big impact. The extremes, wetter winters, up to 14% increase in winter rainfall, and more intense storms predicted. So, sticking with that point, the impact on small change in the average, this graphic just demonstrates that a small change in the average causes a big change in the extremes. It can push the normal to a new normal. In practical terms, we have a lot of examples of that now to draw on of extreme events. Summer 2018 following a long winter period, and then Storm Lorenzo in October, where many houses were flooded, businesses are losing power, and it's difficult to remember even since we've been through a lot since February, but in February of this year, heavy rainfall caused flooding in parts of the country, and then we had an excessively dry spring, which caused a landslide in Leitrim at the Dawn of Hope Bridge as well. And all these just serve to illustrate that unfavorable climate events are going to become more frequent and more extreme. Excuse me, that adaptation planning, in effect, resilience building is crucial to addressing this. So the observed changes in climate, which we've just seen there, changes in air temperature, precipitation patterns, extreme events. In preparing our adaptation plan, these were identified as likely to have the greatest impact on the agricultural sector. And the following impacts here shown as the greatest priority for the sector. There were others, but these are the priority impacts that were identified in our work in preparing. So slurry storage and land spreading, soil quality condition impacted by both wet and dry conditions, windrow due to stormy weather, and a greater increase on, or risk on waterlogged soils, infrastructure damage, and survivability of vector-borne diseases and possible prevalence of an establishment of pests and diseases, and changing pest and disease behaviour, heat stress, and food safety irrigation. The food safety issues which could potentially arise where irrigation interventions are required. And I've already mentioned that this plan, the agriculture plan, was done as part of a suite of plans, if you like, covering a lot of sectors. So there are cross-sectoral adaptation issues as well. Intensification of agriculture, putting pressure on our environment, in particular water quality, land use options not always being correct for soil type, biodiversity suffering as a result of intensification and monocropping, farm infrastructure may be inadequate for future climate scenarios, and increased intensity of rainfall threatens soil function and ability to retain nutrients. So these cross-sectoral issues and priority impacts were explored in greater detail in a series of adaptation case studies that are contained in the plan. Under the headings here, so animal health and welfare, biodiversity and agriculture, food safety and climate change, grassland, horticulture, tillage, water and agriculture, windfall, and forests. And these case studies presented possible adaptation measures that could be useful in making the sector more resilient. So biodiversity and agriculture, use of nature-based solutions approach to adaptation, hedgerows to provide shelter to protect crops from cold and heat, create biodiversity hotspots which can host natural enemies of pests, improving soil structures as a way of facing the challenges of climate change. Under horticulture and tillage, use of catch crop mixtures with different characteristics, such as resistance to pests and diseases, adapt sowing dates, species of variety selection, new agricultural techniques and products. Under grassland, or under a case study in grassland, build fodder reserves, early warning systems to identify deficits in feed. There's also mitigation measures, because mitigation and adaptation go hand in hand a lot of the time. So some adaptation measures have mitigation built into them as well. So use of mitigation species swards, use of mixed species swards and leguminous crops more resilient to increased temperatures. Under animal health and welfare, promoting sustainable animal health and welfare practices, for example, adequate housing and shelter during heat waves. Grassland, maximizing grazing efficiency through recording grass production, and water and agriculture, properly sited and designed slurry stores to prevent runoff. And so conclude from that. So, I mean, the adaptation plan contains a range of these case studies and potential measures that those involved in the sector could go to as a starting point in how they might adapt their own practices, better prepare and plan for the expected changes that we see. In conclusion, we're already experiencing the negative impacts of climate change. Climate change amplifies the existing risks and creates new ones. Adaptation is not an alternative to mitigation, but an essential component in our efforts to reduce the impacts of climate change. And well-planned early adaptation done right saves money, protects nature, and helps to prevent disease later. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. That was an excellent overview of the work that you've been doing on the adaptation side of things. So what we're going to do now is Michael O'Donovan is going to give us a presentation on some of the practical aspects of adaptation, particularly in the context of grassland management. Michael, are you there? Sorry, I need to switch on your video, I think, Michael, do I? So Michael, we had a presentation last week from Keith Lampkin from Met Éireann, and he was showing us some of the work that Teagasc has been doing in association with Met Éireann, particularly around grass growth and grass modelling. That's a project you've been directly involved in, is that right?
That's correct. That's correct, Mark. I'm just trying to share my screen here.
Okay.
Can you see that yet?
Nothing coming through just yet. Yeah, something happening there now.
Have you got that?
Yes, we can see your screen now.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. I for the purpose of this webinar, and to talk about mitigation, climate change mitigation, from the aspect of where we are in the grassland science side of things in Teagasc, one of the key things for us is to try to control and try to improve our understanding of grass growth variation, what's going on with grass growth, and basically how to bring in an early warning system, how to improve our management. So very clear for us, Irish grassland characteristics are very clear in the sense that we have high pasture productivity potential, and there's low enough variability in seasonal supply and quality. And for us, and it's kind of reiterated in the farm to fork strategy that has been produced in the last 6 weeks, if we can increase the level of home produced protein and home produced feed and make that as sustainable as possible, we're going to, move forward in that farm to fork strategy pretty successfully. But as the industry knows, there's inconsistent product prices, and there's rising costs, year on year. There's inflationary costs between inputs and labor. And increased grazed grass, it does decrease the cost inside farm gate, and makes us more and more competitive. And like, one of the key things for us is always to consider what, well managed grazed grass, well utilized grazed pasture, the cost benefit of that relative to other feeds, such as, okay, grass silage is a home produced feed, but it's still nearly 2.5 times the cost of well utilized grass. Then you have the concentrate coming in through the farm gate, which again, good with deer, nearly 5 times. And then you have forage crops, which are kind of opportunistic crops that people grow at generally in the early autumn. They're not without their costs either. And I suppose everything here is in the context of farm to fork. As Damien just alluded to, the climate action plan, water quality, and increasing our air quality. So what I've done here is I've put in some recent weather challenges that we've met, the concept of pasture-based Ireland, some of the drought impacts, especially the drought of 2018. Our new, I suppose, grass growth model, the Moorpark St. Gilles grass growth model, which is driven by LD Ruel, and I suppose what improvements we have to make as regards controlling very grass growth variability. So I just looked for the purpose of this. We're measuring rainfall in Moorpark for the last since 1950, and like, this is probably what you can see per decade as from 1950 up through the decades to the current day. So you can see a steady increase in grass growth through those decades. And then when you look at the 12 months of the year by decade, what's really interesting for me is, and we've targeted seasonal grazing and targeted grazing now at the shoulders of the year. And like, as we have moved through, if we just move through some of the months of February per decade, you can see here, it's probably fairly apparent why we have targeted that, because February-March periods have shown decreased spring rainfall in those periods. But if you just go back to the mid-season, the mid-summer months of let's say May, June, July, we had a lot in Moorpark, and this is the Moorpark side alone. We had a lot less rainfall in those months through the 70s and 80s, and it has begun to increase in the last 20 years. And again, the one apparent thing for us looking at this graph is the movement towards higher rainfall in those winter months. And okay, in the last 9 years, if you look at December, but even December and other in the last decade was considerably lower than this decade. So okay, we've seen an increase in overall annualized rainfall per decade, but there is variation taking place through the months, and I suppose that's where some of our mitigation has to be considered. And I suppose we have looked at that through targeting earlier spring grazing in that February period now. So some of the recent weather challenges, and looking at the recent weather challenges, there's been about 7 weather challenges in the last 11 years. And some of these have varied from 2 weeks up to 3 months. And like the most recent weather challenge, if you just go through these, has been, very low rainfall in the eastern coastal counties in May or June of this year, which caused a fair amount of supplementation intervention to take place. Then the previous one to that would have been the drought of 2018, which would have been probably cost the country about 3 ton of pasture on average, on individual farms. That might have been a lot more considerable. March, April of 18 with Storm Emma, 2 weeks of no growth, which I suppose, did a lot of damage on the farm as regards feed supply. There was a lot of feed being used for a 2 to 3 week period. In that period, there was the delayed spring grass growth. There was no growth there for a number of weeks due to the snowfall that we had. Then there has been, other rain weather events like Storm Ophelia in September, October of 17, which caused a lot of livestock to be housed and constrained a lot of silage harvesting in northwestern Midlands. And 13, a very cold spring. Autumn 12, very late autumn, and the two of these kind of joined onto each other to cause a fodder crisis in the northwest, and then another fodder crisis down in the south. And then May 2009, there was a very heavy rainfall in that month, causing very, very poor grazing conditions, delayed first cut silage, and reduced dry matter production for that year. So, like, of the seven weather events that we've experienced in the last 11 years, by far the most significant was the drought of 2018. And I suppose this just kind of shows you, when I was putting this together, I didn't probably take when you have weather events, you kind of move on and you look to the future. But like we have had a number, so it's no coincidence. And I suppose the thing that we have to be really working towards here is if there's weather events joined to each other, well, then there has to be, at farm level, there has to be big mitigation factors put in place to avoid what we saw in 18. So this is just the grass growth curve of Pasture Base Ireland, and many of you know Pasture Base, which is run and directed by Micheál O'Leary, which is our national grassland database. The inputter of the data is farmer, and basically all it is putting this data together, calculating the growth rates, and then producing reports. And we have a decision support, and then we have a database within the system. And this is basically allowing us to track grass growth rates across farms, within farms, between farms. And this is just the national growth rate that I'm just showing you this morning. So again, what we've seen here this year is, a lag in growth rate here in this May-June period, and then a fairly big compensation here in the last number of weeks, and that growth rate is still hitting above 60 this week. And the big hole there that you see is probably the grass growth from 2018, which as I alluded to earlier, took down dry matter production by about 3 to 3.5 ton across the country, which is a fairly substantial move backwards, and a costly move backwards for many farms. So like, it's always good, and the big good thing about Pasture Base is that we know from week to week where we are nationally. We have farms measuring from Skull and West Cork up to Mallinhead and Donegal, across to Louth. So like, we have a huge, I suppose, amount of data coming through the system. And it was making use of this data and making good decisions with this data is probably the real move forward for us. This is the farm grass dry matter production from 13 when we started PBI up to today. And I just looked at where we were this time last year, where we were this time in 2018. There was about 6.5 ton of grass grown. Last year in 19, about 8 ton, and currently this year we're sitting at about 7.8 ton. But if you put in the last 2 weeks growth rate, we're probably up to where we were in 2009. And like, cumulatively, if you look at this is the full year's cumulative dry matter production, where we are growing nationally, back 2018, where we grew about just over the 11 ton, we're growing in and around 13 ton of dry matter. There's some good years where we're maybe getting a very good year in 17 to 14 ton, but on average we're growing about 13.3 ton of grass production across the year. And there is differences when you go into enterprises. The dry stock that are measuring grass are growing about 10.5 to 11 ton of dry matter. Like, this slide just shows you the dry matter production distribution of grass production across the 3 years. So what I have here is the amount of dry matter produced, or the proportion of dry matter produced here. So if we look at 25% of the population are growing about 13 ton of grass dry matter here in 2009. And what I just want you to focus on here is, as we move through the years, in 2018, 25% of the population grew about 10 ton. So a straight move back of 3 ton in that population. And again, you have the extremes here. You have some farms who grew 16, 15, 16 ton. And in 2018, these farms were in the west of Ireland. They weren't in the east. And then you had, farms which were really restricted by grass production in that drought year, grew 6 to 7 ton. But that was a lower part of the population. And in 17, then we had nearly 30% of the population grew 14 ton of grass dry matter. So I suppose when you're looking at these averages, averages can be deceptive. And I suppose this is, a much better way of looking at the data and seeing where the proportions lie as regards dry matter production. So you can see, a large chunk of the population are well capable of growing, 13 to 14 ton onwards. And farm environments, and this is the one thing that we have to consider. Farm environments are not the same. And I have the grass output graph there for Ireland, and many people have listened to us before, and Ireland is not that big. The cumulative grass dry matter production differences across the country are very small. And that, we might have said that 10 or 15 years ago, but when you look at PBI data, there's farms across the country well capable of growing 15, 16, 17 ton with appropriate management, with appropriate soil fertility. Okay, in the northwest, there's higher rainfall and there's a later start to growth, but that doesn't mean the cumulative figure is that much different than the South Midlands. And a lot of the differences here that we see at farm level are enterprise driven, they're management driven, in the sense that early turnout, grazings, the timing of things, the timing of grazing issues is crucially important. Climate, yes, and how you adapt to climate and how you set up a farm system to climate is very, very important. And that's one of the reasons we have this heavy soils program running. The use of farm roadways, the use of on-off grazing, they're adaptations to climate, and many farmers have put them in place. Soil type, yes, there's challenges with heavier soil types as regards grazing. They can be very, very productive mid-season. That's another challenge as regards timing of grazing, timing of taking out silage, whatever. And soil fertility, like the soil fertility challenge is just basically reacting to a soil report. I don't think there's there's much more I can say on that, but soil fertility is basically good management, reacting what the report says, and getting a nutrient management plan in place. As regards sward species, we have a considerable amount of evidence now out there showing the use and the advantage of grass clover swards. We've about 8 years work from here in Moore Park, and about 6 years in County, showing the benefit of high clover pastures and what they can grow, what the animal effects are from them, and we are going to be met with lower probably nitrogen application patterns. And one of the key things that we have to put in place is clover on farms. Like the evidence around multi-species is not there yet, and I would say the multi-species work is in its infancy, and the persistency of multi-species swards is something that is going to be challenging in the medium and longer term for those swards. While they may be there at the start, they may not be there at the end. And the outcomes here that we're talking about here can be entirely different. You know, I could give you the range and differences there in dry matter production for all those factors, but you know, if you can manage and join the positives of all those factors together, you know, farms can produce 13 to 15 ton of grass dry matter consistent. So I just wanted to look at inside in this because of, you know, many of us didn't probably know what a large grass deficit was until 2018 came. And like, you know, at the time, different, I suppose there was different reports of the cost of drought coming out. And this is work, this is the result from the National Farm Survey from Brian Moan's group for the last 3 years. So if you just focus here on 2018, concentrate costs increased by about 2 cents a litre over 17. And concentrate input per cow went up by about 300 kilos. And pasture and forage costs also went up by another cent a litre. So like purely from the deficit of grass production, the costs of concentrate and the cost of pasture and forage costs rose by about 3 cents a litre. Number of grazing days moved backward by about 6. And the one interesting thing here is, and this is from the dairy side, the milk produced actually stayed the same from the previous year. So, you know, farmers put in extra feed, but got actually no extra response from that feed that went in that year. And the total costs, you can see here, the total costs, you know, went up by about 4 cents a litre. So I suppose it's worth considering when you're putting in all this feed, and at the end of when you come to, you know, December, and you look at the budget from the farm, and there's you know, no extra revenue coming from the feed source. It's probably a huge pressure on the farm incomes, and it is a huge pressure on farm incomes, and it's something that we probably have to be cognizant about. And like what I looked at here was the cost to a farm, a 40-hectare farm of that drought was about 16,000 euro, which is a substantial cost. And like on a per hectare, that's about 400 euro per hectare added feed costs in the 18. And no added performance. That's probably the key thing that we have to focus on here. No added performance from this extra feed. And when you look at the data, and I didn't show it here in this slide, the lower stock farms, and like by virtue of the fact of them being lower stocked, you would say that they were in a better position, like to cope with this. They actually had from the National Farm Survey data higher feed costs, and that's something that we should consider here. You know, just because you're lower stocked, we have to consider. You should be considering: are you using the feed inside the farm gate well enough? And you maybe could consider that they're not, maybe these lower stock farms are not focused enough on pasture. And then from 2019, there's the residual feed costs. And in fairness to farmers out there, you know, they built surplus, they mitigated this effect by building surplus silage, and they carried that was a carried cost into 2019. So you can see there's added awareness from the previous year on this. So one of the key things that we've looked at in the last probably, and one of the key limitations out there in grassland science in the world, you could say, is the lack of a model to predict grass growth, and the lack of a usable model to predict grass growth that's used by the industry. And a number of my colleagues, Lawrence Chalou, Deirdre Hennessy, Ellie Ruel, and some real collaborative work that we've put in place with INRA in St. Giles with Luke Dellaby, has come to the fruition of delivering a Moore Park St. Giles predictive grass growth model, where we're taking account of the climate, and that's data coming from Met Éireann, daily data coming from Met Éireann, data coming from our farmers, which is pasture-based data on grass, pasture covers, and then also the farm data coming from the fertilizer management and the background soil fertility of the farm. So through this model, we have delivered a farm predictive grass growth model that now is being used, and it's in its second year of a pilot program on about 60 farms out nationally, and it has come to fruition where we now have where we have accurate grass growth data from farms, accurate soil fertility data, accurate up-to-date soil management data, we can be quite accurate as regards the prediction of grass growth. And like, why is this important? It's important because, like, if you do a farm cover today, that's last week's growth. It's not really telling you much about what's going to happen in the next 7 to 10 days. And ultimately, if you want to be ahead of the game here, you have to know what's going to happen in the next 7 to 10 days as regards, your management decisions for that. You can get some long-range forecasts, and I think Keith spoke about that last week. Some of them can be about 30% accurate to what happens. But I suppose what we want to get to is a high level of accuracy that we're actually preempting the decision making for the next 10 days, 7 to 10 days, 2 weeks. And like the grass growth model here, weekly growth prediction, if you look on the left here is the counties showing the current grass growth, and on the right you can look at the moist model predictive grass growth. And in any 1 week, these can move by 25, 30 kilos. And I suppose that's the magnitude of management change that has to take place to alleviate some of the things that can happen at farm level. And one of the key things for ourselves here in Teagasc and working with Met Éireann and trying to join up with other agencies is that we're using data properly, and then we can make proper use of this data to disseminate out this nationally. And the last fortnight, Met Éireann have used this, and thanks to the people in Met Éireann for taking this on board. They have used this in the last 2 weeks weather forecast, farming weather forecast, and I think it's adding the responses that we've seen to this. It has been very, very positive from the farming community. So I suppose, what do we do? What is this going to do for us? Well, it's building awareness as regards grass supply locally and ultimately through the Met Éireann network nationally. Ultimately, what we're trying to do here is making decisions based through data. It's based through the data we fed in through the system. From the farms that have been on the model, they are now using the model outputs in grassland decisions as regards, what decisions they can make for soilage conservation, what decisions they can make for stocking rate, what decisions they're making for nitrogen. And that's probably the one key thing for us. The model output has given us really good decisions as regards nitrogen use on farm, whether you can cut back on nitrogen or whether you need nitrogen to increase at different points. And that's one of the key things we see, moving forward with this. Ultimately, we want to continue to improve this and to get good feedback down through the system. And in time, through Vista Milk, we'll start machine learning this data, and we'll start benchmarking decisions. What if you do this? What if you do that? But that is this line of research is about 18 months in fruition. So for us, as regards mitigation, the first thing I have to say here is no grass growing year is similar. No grass growing week is the same either. So like, we have to embrace this fact, and we have to build a national awareness as regards grass growth, what it is, what it's going to be. Grass production, I'm afraid it requires continuous tracking. And for us in Ireland, grass is central to our feed in ruminant systems. Similar to New Zealand, it's the central feed, it's the base feed. If you read the farm to fork strategy, we are well positioned to take advantage of that strategy because of the fact that we can, produce so much protein inside farm gate. Farm self-sufficiency, sometimes it's overlooked until there is a supply issue. And, 2018 has shown us really clearly that conserved feed, there has to be conserved feed surplus on farms. And that's about 400 kilos of dram per livestock unit. And my colleague Joe Patton today is coming out with a report, or a survey report, where he has shown that this year there's about a 17% feed surplus on farms, based on a survey done on farms nationally, about 700 farms nationally, in July. And that's a very, very, very positive position for the country to be in at the moment. We have to continue to actively pursue grass measurement across enterprises. Okay, at the moment it's very much driven by the dairy side, but equally the dry stock side we would say that it's equally and as important on the dry stock side, and we want to continue to move this forward all the time. The more the grass growth model, will again take on more farms in the coming years, and we'll get probably better predictions from that. As regards annual fodder budget, I've alluded to that, and that's available for all farms. And I suppose ultimately, what we're trying to do to mitigate climate changes is we're trying to equip ourselves, in the industry, especially our farmers in the industry, to react earlier in the medium, longer and short term to grass supply changes. So Mark, that's me done, so I might be a bit over time.
Thanks, Michael. That was excellent, and some really exciting research going on there in the whole area of grass predictive modelling. It's nice to see it actually coming to fruition on Met Éireann. Damien, if you could ask you to join us again, and maybe we'll give Michael a minute to catch his breath. Damien and Michael, thank you for two excellent presentations. Damien, just in relation to the climate adaptation plan for Ireland, there was a recent finding by the Supreme Court that Ireland's national mitigation plan falls well short of being specific enough. Does this have implications for our adaptation planning in terms of the metrics involved there?
In the first instance, I'd revert to Minister Ryan, is the lead minister, his department, on that, and his own comments were that it's a positive, and they're going to review to see the implications of that decision. In terms of the impact on us for adaptation planning and the second adaptation plan, that's still extant. In some ways, the 2017 mitigation plan was superseded by the Climate Action Plan 2018. And what we're working off in the sectoral adaptation plan is still there. It's a plan that is set to run a minimum or a maximum of 5 years from 2019. It'll have to be reviewed after that. It contains 16 actions and 41 sub-actions that we've now moved on to an implementation phase on that. So, the ruling requiring more specific targets in the mitigation plan is something that is going to be reviewed in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Energy. But for our own part, practically on our day-to-day work and implementing the adaptation plan, it's fine for the time being. Oh, you're muted, Mark, sorry.
Sorry about that. I have some background noise here. Damien, we have a question here about how does sustainable adaptation sit with sustainable intensification? This notion of, I suppose, reducing the carbon footprint per litre or per kilogram of food produced.
I suppose in the first instance, I'd say it can be looked at separate to sustainable intensification. There's a lot of adaptation measures that properly well cited measures don't necessarily contradict intensification. I think of things like hedgerows and field margins and riparian buffers, and these sort of adaptation interventions in the first instance. In our sectoral adaptation plan, as part of our public consultation, the issue of intensification was raised, as a potential threat to biodiversity in that regard. But a lot of the measures in the plan, I would envisage them as separate to that issue, or potentially separate. They're no harm, they're benefits, and they have potential co-benefits in terms of biodiversity and wider issues beyond intensification.
Okay. There's just a question in relation to silvopasture. I presume it relates to the potential role of agroforestry. Do you see that this could become an important part of the adaptation plan, particularly in relation to animal shelter, the potential for heat stress and other inclement weather impacts?
Yeah, it didn't necessarily feature in, so say I was talking about the potential adaptation measures in our case studies, and agroforestry and silvopasture didn't necessarily feature there, but it's certainly a measure with potential, and again it has so many co-benefits in terms of sequestration as well, but like you're talking about shelter for animals and biosecurity and biodiversity generally. So it's a although it wasn't necessarily in this plan, it certainly is a good adaptation measure.
Michael, if I could turn to you in relation to, I suppose you talked about 2018 being a difficult year for grassland production in this country, and a lot of extra concentrates fed without a return in yield as a result. The whole question of resilience was really a big conversation point that year, wasn't it? It was, how resilient are our grassland systems in Ireland? Are we over reliant on certain aspects, or are we, looking at the grassland as the too much of the part of an animal's diet, or how do we get around that issue in the future, where we could see a lot more variability in grass production in a year? There's obviously grassland production is reliant on external inputs and fertilizer. We see the farm to fork you mentioned in your presentation. It is targeting reduced nitrogen inputs into farms. How do you see all of those different factors, our Irish farming, grassland farming, responding to those issues?
Yeah, and I suppose the reality of E18 was, it probably was a major wake-up call to everybody, really, Teagasc and the rest of the industry. But I suppose previously, when you talked about resilience and that word goes around, people throw it out there, and I suppose resilience is trying to respond to things that come at you and have a response in place. And on heavy soils, if you talk about heavy soils, we always spoke pre last 10 years about a buffer zone as regards feed supply and having that in there. And now in the last number of years, and that's probably since 2009, there has to be a feed buffer zone as regards the system for feed supply on dry farms across the country. And that's probably something that we've learned over time, and 18 has probably really shown us that, because what really 18 has shown us, when feed is in short supply, bought in feed gets really expensive. And the only way you can mitigate against that feed cost is to have feed available inside farm gate, and ultimately that is grass silage. And that's probably something that there has been real focus put on in the last 2 years probably. And it's fair to say that some farmers had that in place previous to that anyway. But it has been really a hard lesson for everybody, that when something gets into short supply, it gets expensive, and if it gets expensive, the animal doesn't respond any better with that expensive feed input to it being when it's normal. As regards resilience, and I've seen some of the questions here, fertilizer. The one key thing about fertilizer and when we move forward with clover is, that's going to take a lot of better management to come forward with the same performance from grass-based systems. It is not a simple species. It requires high soil fertility, high K, high lime status, built up over time, and it requires good grazing management, and it requires good grazing management to maintain itself into the sward. And that's going to be a big challenge, and it's going to be a problem for some farms. And that is the reality of that. But what clover can do, and Deirdre's Hennessy's work in Moorpark, clover can fix nitrogen very well if it's there in a high proportion. And like what we want is we want 20-25% of clover in the sward on average across the year, and that's what we were looking at, where we would see it giving added value to the sward. And like that's to answer the question, that's going to give us resilience going forward as well, to as regards fertilizer supply and having fertilizer there being fixed across the year. We have to start the aspect of pasture base and putting pasture base out on more farms. Where we are with pasture base at the moment is about 500,000 to 600,000 cows in the country are managed through that system, which is huge progress. But we'd like to see more of an impetus built at dry stock level. We have about 6,000 farmers in the system in PBI. We have about 2,000 covers a week going through the system. And like our targets would be that should be, higher. And, that's a continuous work in progress. And it's actually not surprising, but this year, through COVID, we've seen a substantial rise in users in that system. But we'll continue to strive to make that system much more user friendly.
Damien, if I could turn to you in relation to the policy levers and supports that will be available to the agricultural sector over the next number of years, is it seen that the cap will there be measures included in the cap that will support farmers during this transitional phase, or in adapting to the new climate scenario?
Well, I mean, the cap is currently, discussions are ongoing in relation to that. There are actions in the adaptation plan around feeding into that process on a term in terms of even financial risk management, and that types of things are certainly feeding into the discussion. But with regard to any agreements on that, I wouldn't have information that I could say on that, just that it is an action in the adaptation plan feed into that discussion, better allow farmers through CAP to prepare for adaptation. And in the programme for government, there's a commitment there to implement the adaptation plan as well, and those measures.
Okay. And is it foreseen that there will be the likes of emergency funds or those types of funds available in the scenario where we do see extreme weather events in the future?
I wouldn't have that information to say if there would be emergency funds. I wouldn't have that, and I wouldn't like to comment from the department.
Okay. Michael, lots of questions coming in here around the fertilizer side of things. Maybe we just go through some of those questions quickly. Can you expand on why the West had more water available for dry matter production in 2018, please?
I suppose the west of Ireland in 18 didn't seem to get it got slightly more rainfall than the southern half at different specific times in that early June, July period. And luckily for them, they had quite a good year as regards production, whereas we were sitting on temperatures of 25, 26 degrees Celsius here, where everything was stalled, and we went down to 10 degrees, 10 kilos of growth in that period. So it was probably just a directional rainfall issue. They're probably having a bit more rainfall. They're having substantially more rainfall than us at the moment, and hopefully that will stop in the next day or two. So it was just a directional rainfall issue.
The question around optimal soil fertility, I guess we know that there are a lot of soils out there that are suboptimal, and maybe there's there's levels of nitrogen going out on pastures that maybe aren't needed because there are, you know, other constraints, other constraining, be it lime or other elements that are limiting. Is that something you've come across in your work?
Generally, what I see now is that there's a fair amount of awareness through the soils campaign across the last number of years, that it's fairly clear that, you know, pH has to rise rather than putting in more nitrogen. So, where my view on it is that you know, there's a lot more awareness now that, you know, pH has to be right, and you know, elements P and K have to be right, rather than just lowering in high levels of nitrogen, you know, that are not going to give you the response if those other elements were right. So, you know, I think that awareness is out there. You know, I don't think there's guys putting out nitrogen willy-nilly as regards, and with poor soil fertility. They're probably using a compound more likely. But like, soil fertility is something that it's like grass. It's something that can't be stopped. You can't stop the campaign with that. And you know, where we're going with this for the future is that our soil fertility has to be higher if you want either clover or if you want to go to multi-species fruit. You know, clover won't stay in the sward at soil pH of 6. And as regards the multi-species question there, I typed up the answer, but you know, there is a full farm system study which Brendan Horn is starting. He's reseeding the swards at the moment over here in Curtains, and that's going to be a comparative study. I think it's the only farm system study evaluating multi-species versus clover versus grass only, with dairy cows. So that should be. It's time for to look at that to see what the true effect of those swards are, and he's looking at the environmental aspect of it as well.
And I know there's other work going on. Damien, we spoke before about a project that NUI Galway are working on in relation to climate adaptation. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's the sequester project that it's taken place in NUIG and UL, and it's really trying to define what we mean when we talk about approach to carbon neutrality for the sector. So obviously we have our targets and we have set out what we have to do, but defining what a carbon neutral sector in agriculture and food systems will look like, that work is ongoing. I think that project is about a year to it, and maybe another run to another. I'm not sure it's 21 or 22, but it's only been going a year, but it'll hopefully define what we mean for the sector, or at least give us options to consider for defining what an approach to carbon neutrality. Just on adaptation, generally, there's currently an open public consultation on the EU adaptation strategy. So, people involved in the sectors and participants here today, that consultation is open through the. When you find it online for the EU adaptation strategy up the 20th of August. If people did want to feed in, sector-specific comments on that.
How do they do that, Damien? Is there?
It's online. I think it's through the commission, but they can go online and feed into that open. It's an EU consultation.
Great. Okay, Damien and Michael, we have, I'm afraid, time has caught up on us again, so we've come to the end of our session. Thank you both sincerely for the time and effort that you've put into your presentations for today. And we've had lots of interesting questions coming through here. I think we've got through most of them, but what we'll do is we'll download these questions and maybe get back to some individuals afterwards, so we can handle it that way. So thanks again. Next week, we'll be speaking to Donal O'Brien, who's going to be talking about carbon sequestration in grassland. And the prospects there and what's on offer through the grassland in Ireland from a sequestration point of view. So I want to thank our speakers again today, Michelle Lavelle for helping out in the background, and please do get access. You can get access to the YouTube video of today on the Teagasc YouTube channel. Or indeed, if you want to see the presentation, it'll be on the Teagasc website in the next number of days. It just leaves for me to thank our production team, Andy Boland, Yvonne Maher, Pat Murphy, all of our partners, and thank you for watching, and do join us again next week for the next in our series.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.